Welcome to week 9 of the advanced 10-week course. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys all for this course. It's been really fantastic. Next week we'll be just kind of covering the exam and trying to schedule an exam. I'm thinking that we'll probably have the exams probably in August or September. And so now that we have our program specialist, so we actually just hired our program specialist, Omar Martinez, yesterday. So he'll be in Fort Worth. We have Lauren Ward, who I think spoke to you guys at some point. She's located in Angleton, Texas, and then Molly Keck. And so we'll have apiaries across the state. And so hopefully you can have some testing at those three locations. But as always, we always have our master beekeeping testing at the state meetings. And so we have the Texas Beekeeper Association Summer Clinic in Abilene this year on June 20th, whatever that Friday is. Yeah, so the actual meeting's on the 21st, but we have the master beekeeping testing on the 20th. It'll be probably from 1 to 5, and so I'll send you guys information for that. And because you guys all registered for this course, there's no fee involved with actually taking the exam. But afterwards, there's a social hour. And so you guys can sign up for that social hour. There's like a cost involved with the plate, but that all goes to the nonprofit Project Apis mellifera, which is a really important organization that funds a lot of my research and does a lot of really great work for beekeepers across the state. They've done a lot of really great work with AAA last mites. So if you guys do decide to test during the summer clinic, it'd be great to see you guys all at the social hour and hopefully take a big picture. We'll also have testing probably in San Antonio in I'm thinking probably mid-May. We'll be having at UTSA with Dr. Ozturt's lab. And so if you want to take the test there, you can. And then we'll also have testing in the fall conference in Waco, I believe, sometime in November, probably the second weekend of November. So those are our testing events, but we will have testing in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and probably San Antonio, probably August or September for everybody. Um, and then next week we'll be covering just this exam. So I'll talk about what's involved with the testing. We'll talk more about public service hours and what's involved with that. We'll talk a little bit more about the tracking system, and then more importantly, I'll share a study guide, and then maybe a practice quiz for you guys all to take. Perfect. Well, I want to introduce Wizzy Brown. Some of you may know her. I'll have her give her own introduction, but she's sort of an expert entomologist. She's a really fantastic Facebook page. So she has these really cool short videos on insects across Texas, and so she can talk more about that. But today she'll be talking about bee plants and pollination. So Wizzy, I'll let you introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm Wizzy. I have always been a bug nerd, even when I was a kid. Fortunately, my parents didn't squash it. Um, and I have a bachelor's degree in entomology from Ohio State. I got my master's from Texas A&M in entomology. My background is in structural entomology. My research was on parasitoids of cockroaches. And I actually worked in the Moody Gardens Pyramid before they renovated everything and they had a massive cockroach problem. So I was controlling their cockroaches with little tiny parasitic wasps. So I've been in extension 22 years now, I think. Doesn't seem that long. Um, and yeah, that's just me. And I'm here if you have questions on anything, if you need stuff identified or whatever. I mean, just let us know. I don't know if Molly mentioned, but we do have a podcast that we do, her and myself, that's called Bugs by the Yard. And that can stream from whatever podcast place that you stream from. And then, as Garrett mentioned, I do have on social media, it's on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. All of the same videos are posted on all three things. So you don't have to follow me on all of them, just whatever one you use. And if you don't want to follow me, you don't have to do that either. But it's called Backyard Bug Hunt. And it's just whatever bugs that I'm happening to see. A lot of them are from my backyard or wherever I'm traveling. So that is a little bit about me. I guess the other thing that people always ask me, I always get have you always been interested in bugs? The other thing is, where did I get my name? So as you see on my thing there, My name is Elizabeth. That's my given name. Wizzy is a nickname that I've had since I was about 6 months old, which my brother gave me because he couldn't pronounce his L's properly. And so I have been Wizzy ever since. So if you want my attention, you need to say Wizzy because that's what I go by. The only person who calls me Elizabeth is my mom when I'm in trouble. So I am going to turn off my camera because I find it distracting when I'm doing talk and seeing myself. So I am human. I am here. Um, and I'm just going to get into it now. Oh, all right. All right. So like Garrett said, I'm apparently wrapping things up and I'm going to be talking about bee plants and pollination. Um, I guess I should have switched that because we're going to talk about pollination first and then we're going to get into the bee plants after that. So I think everybody on here probably already knows what pollination is, or at least hopefully you do. And essentially, the big thing is that it is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the flower. So the anther is the male part of the flower. So that's where the arrows are pointing. And those are going to create the pollen, which holds the male cells. The stigma is the female part of the flower. And so essentially when pollination occurs, whether that's by insects or some other means, that pollen is transferring onto the stigma from that anther. And we'll get further into pollination more so. That's just like the simple, stupid thing. So you have this in the in the book chapter. There's the drawing of the flower with the different parts of it. Excuse me. So starting off on the flower, the petal of the flower, those are often brightly colored, and those are kind of a softer part of the flower. And that is going to be one of the things that can help attract the pollinators. They are going to be looking for specific colors depending on which pollinators you're looking at. And so that petal form can actually, or petal form and color can help them find where that flower is located. The sepal is very closely related to that. It kind of encloses the petals or the buds, and those are the harder part. They're tougher than the petals. They are going to essentially kind of hold in those petals so they don't fall off. They're enclosing it. The receptacle is going to be the part of the flower stalk where the flowers attach, and that's more of like a inner part of that. So if you're not dismantling the flower itself, you're probably not going to necessarily see the receptacle part. If you would buy, I don't know, like a lily of some sort, which is really easy to see kind of all of the flower parts. If you remember like basic biology and you were learning this, that's often the flower that they choose because you can take them apart and see everything. The pedicel, that's just kind of the fancy word for the stem or the stalk of the flower. So that's just kind of holding things up. The pistil is going to be the female part of the plant. And so we're looking on the right-hand side, and the pistil is going to be made up of certain parts. So what we see generally when we're looking at a flower from the outside is the stigma. And the stigma is going to be sticky, which if you think about it, that makes sense because you want the stigma to be able to kind of grab onto or hold onto that pollen when it's transferred over from the anther. The style is the long tubular structure that connects the stigma down to the ovary. And then the ovary part is down at the base of the flower. And that is going to contain the ovules, which are going to have the female sex cells on it. Looking at the male parts, you have the stamen, and that is essentially consisting of the anther, which again produces the pollen, and then a filament, which is again just like a long kind of tubular structure that will hold that anther up. So it's kind of up in the air and making that pollen accessible to the various pollinators. So I decided to go with the video because I thought this really was the best way to go because it explains it really well. If it's going to play.
Is there a sound to this?
What did you say?
Is there sound to the video?
Yes, is it not?
I don't hear anything.
Does anybody else?
Yep. No, no sound. Everybody's saying there's no sound.
That is terrible.
That's weird.
I can
May-
hear the sound. That's very strange.
Maybe you can narrate it.
See, I think,
Yes, I will
yeah,
just narrate through the video.
I think sometimes it helps if you present the, you have to present the actual video.
Okay, it's all good. I'll narrate. Okay. So the male part, we kind of already went to this. So the anther is producing the pollen, and then that gets taught onto the stigma, and that goes down into the ovule, moves down the tube. So a lot of times with the insects, they are going to collect that pollen off of the anther or it touches on their body. And then when they're getting nectar, they're going to move that over to the anther. Pollination can either happen on the same flower. So that's what that first one is. So they can collect pollen on the flower and then pollinate the same flower, or they can collect pollen on one flower and then transfer that pollen over to another flower on the same plant. So that's just pollination. When we're dealing with cross pollination, that's what it's going to show you next, where they're taking pollen from the flower of one plant and then moving that over to pollen of or to the flower of another plant. But it's going to have to be a plant that is the same species. So you're not going to be able to cross pollinate into a plant of some other species. So the self-pollination is any time that pollen is moved within the same plant. Cross-pollination is going to be from one plant to another plant, but it's going to be the same species of plant. That's kind of the easy way to say it. Okay, so when we're looking, it's going to talk about insect pollinated, and then we're going to go into wind pollinated, which doesn't affect y'all necessarily directly. But this is starting off by talking about the parts of a flower that are going to attract pollinators to it. And usually that is going to be the petals and the color. Again, depending on what color it is, it's going to be attractive to different types of insects, which we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. Fragrance is another one that can really work into things. So it's going to give off a certain smell. And again, depending on what is coming in to pollinate it, those smells can be different. There are some fly pollinated plants that smell like rotting meat. And so that's a little bit different than something that a bee would be attracted to. So the nectaries on some plants, they are going to produce nectar, which you guys are, that's what you're really going for. You want the plants with those because then those are going to provide that nectar source for the bees. And a lot of times when we're dealing with that, those bees are going down into the flower to get to the nectar or, getting into that part of the nectar or part of the flower. And that will, as they're doing that, allow those anthers to put pollen on their body, either, accidentally or, there's the electrostatic charges that some insects have. It, again, depends on the insect. But nectar essentially is going to be one of those things that will actually bring them into the flower because it's almost like a reward that they're getting. So this is talking about when the insect goes down into the flower itself to get to the nectar, and those pollen grains are going to get put on or attracted to the insect. And the pollen is sticky or whatever, that way it actually attaches to the insect. And when, a lot of them, the insects will groom themselves and they can put those pollen grains into particular areas depending on, again, what type of insect it is. And then they can carry that on to other flowers. Of course, when they're grooming themselves, they don't necessarily get everything into, like the pollen baskets or anything like that. So there's still going to be stray pollen kind of floating around on their body. And that would be the pollen that would typically get transferred because it's not, crammed down into a certain section of the body. So you could see with that bee, even though it had all of the pollen kind of a lot of pollen crammed down onto its hind legs, it still had pollen on other parts of its body. So that, since that pistil is going to be sticky at the tip, then that can attach those pollen grains and kind of grab hold of them. So that transfers over to the female reproductive part. Oh, goodness. So this one right here is talking about how some insects are going to actually consume the pollen. I don't know how I made that screen a lot bigger than it was supposed to be. But even though there are some insects that are going to consume pollen from certain plants, that doesn't mean that they're not going to still pollinate, because a lot of times if they are going to be flowers that are going to be having that happen, then they're producing enough pollen that there's still enough to kind of transfer over. I know I talk to a lot of master gardeners that are very concerned about beetles and things like that that are actually going to be consuming the pollen, because they're like, well, how is that going to help things? They're causing issues. And that's not really the case. I mean, while they eat pollen, they're not eating absolutely everything. So you still have that pollination occurring. And I'm going to try to fix this screen because I don't know what happened right there. There we go. Of course, and it starts. So this is one of those, it's a term, mutualism is going to be where you have two organisms that are doing something that's going to benefit both of them. Again, probably something that y'all already know, but that is something that is happening in between these plants that are becoming pollinated and the insects that are getting some sort of a food, whether that is pollen or nectar. So that is a mutualistic relationship. And this one's just telling you it's not, and again, you probably know, of course, that it's not just insects that are going to pollinate plants. We also have things like birds, there are reptiles and various other things. Again, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So this is a plant that is wind pollinated, and this is technically the flower part of the plant. It's just built in a different way. So when the wind blows, the pollen from the male part of the flower can come into contact with the female part of the flower. So it'll show you a diagram in a minute so you can see kind of the pieces. Since these ones are not attracting animals and they are pollinated by the wind, they are going to essentially not be big and showy. So they can kind of get away with, well, looking like that, I guess. So they don't have the petals that are going to attract them. They don't have the smells that are going to attract insects or other animals. So this is definitely a different type of structure. So this is showing you the stigmas right there. And those are going to be the sticky parts. And then we're going to have the anthers that are going to produce the pollen. So when we're looking at the insect pollinated flower versus the wind pollinated flower, the anthers on the insect pollinated flowers are actually within the flower itself, because they are trying, and the nectary, of course, is down at the bottom. So they're going to have that insect go down into the flower itself to get to that nectar. And then as they're doing that, they're going to come into contact with the anthers, which is going to pick up that pollen on the body. If we look at the wind pollinated, everything's just kind of floating out there in the breeze because it needs to be exposed to the wind. So you're going to have the anther kind of set up so when it's blowing around, that pollen is going to become loose, and then it's going to essentially blow into the the stigma. So the other big difference with wind pollinated versus insect pollinated flowers are going to be the insect pollinated flowers. We said that they are going to be sticky or spiky, so they can kind of grab hold of that animal and be transferred. They are also larger. When we have wind pollinated plants, those pollen grains are going to be typically smaller and lighter because they want to be able to release from those anthers and actually blow in the wind to get to the stigma. So they have to be lightweight and be able to transfer readily off of one surface onto another. The other big thing is the numbers, and that's what you saw just kind of pop up on the slide. So pollen grains on insect pollinated plants are going to be produced typically in smaller numbers, which if you think about it, they still produce a lot of pollen. So just imagine how much the wind pollinated plants are going to produce. So they have to have larger numbers because there is kind of a reduced chance that those things are going to actually come into contact with the stigma of a plant for pollination to occur. So they got to put more out there. It's kind of like if you would compare the pollen grains being produced, like if we talk about insects having offspring, they typically lay hundreds of eggs because not all of those offspring are going to make it to adulthood. So they're producing a lot, hoping that a few of them will make it to adulthood and then reproduce and pass on that genetic information. Whereas us as humans, since we have care of our young, then we tend to produce less offspring because more of them are going to make it to adulthood. So we don't have to try to have, 200 kids to make sure that somebody reaches to adulthood. So it's kind of the same thing, only with pollen. So the other thing that just showed you is I said that the stigma on the insect pollinated flower is going to be sticky. So it grabs onto that pollen as that insect is moving past. When we're looking at wind pollinated, they tend to be feathery because that is going to, again, increase the surface area so they can capture that pollen as it moves past in the wind. All right, we're moving on to the next part, and that is essentially fertilization. So once the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma, they actually have to move down into that ovary and get to the ovules so they can actually have fertilization occur. So the pollen will move from the anther to the stigma, which we already kind of talked about that, right? Once that hits into the stigma, that is going to then start, it almost kind of like germinates, and the pollen tube starts to move down into the ovary structure. And then you see the black part of that is going to be essentially the reproductive material or whatever. And so that will go into the ovule, which is causing the fertilization. And essentially here, this is where, cells start fusing together and separating and creating a zygote. When the zygote starts to divide, that is going to form an embryo. And that is going to turn into essentially a seed. So they're going to have the different parts of the plant there, which again, you have that in your chapter. There's going to be the food store. There's going to be the radicule, which is going to actually turn into the root. And then they're going to also have that seed coat, which is essentially going to be a protective layer. And depending on, again, the plant, that seed coat can turn into different things. So this is just showing you the ovary. Let me close this. The ovary is going to turn into fruit. So if you have a plant that is going to have a fruiting body, that fruit, like an apple that we consume, is the ovary that has developed over time. And then those ovules are going to be the seeds that you find inside of it. So when you flip it this way, you kind of see, it makes it very obvious how that happens. All right. And we're not going into germination. So if you want to watch that video, go check out Science Sauce on Gracious.
So we had a really good question in the chat.
Okay.
And let me repost it there for you, so you don't have to scroll back and find it. I think it was Owen that asked.
I cannot see the chat in this. I'm going to have to stop sharing.
If
I have it here.
Okay.
So it says, if the tip is sticky, what mechanism moves the pollen down to the ovule? Gravity, or do plants have some way to get the two together?
So when the pollen grains hit onto the stigma, which is sticky, it grabs hold, but it's almost like the pollen itself is germinating like a seed would. So it's not necessarily the whole entire pollen grain. That one the pollen, it's hard to describe. I'm going to say it germinates like a seed and it starts to grow that tube. And the cell, the male sex cell, is essentially what is moving down into the ovule. And then that will get into the ovary, and then it'll get into the ovules and it will form that zygote. So it's not the whole entire pollen grain that moves down necessarily. It is the male genetic material. Did that make sense?
Yep, he said thank you.
So it's okay. Yeah, as soon as it touches, it's done. It's going forward from there on its own. Yeah, gotcha. Good question.
Okay, so what are our pollinators? So me generally as an entomologist, I am way more interested in the insect pollinators, but there are birds, hummingbirds are probably the ones that people think of. There are bats and other small mammals. There are reptiles like geckos and things like that. And then we also have wind, like we mentioned before, and we can also have water move pollen as well. When we're looking at insects, typically those are going to be bees, wasps, ants. We also have flies, which you see a fly here. Those are tachinid fly that you see. We also have butterflies and moths, and then also beetles. So with honeybees as pollinators, I mean, you guys know this, obviously. They are excellent pollinators because they collect a lot of pollen and nectar. They are looking for those particular resources. They're collecting the pollen for protein. They're feeding that to the offspring or their larvae. And then the nectar is essentially their carbohydrate or their energy source. And they'll carry that back and make the honey and all of that good stuff. So they are wonderful pollinators and excellent to have, um, pollinating plants, which is why they are commonly used to do commercial pollination. So this is why you're moving these colonies to certain areas at certain times of the year, so they can then go out into the fields and pollinate certain crops that we're growing. And honeybees pollinate about a third of our food, which is bananas. Well, crazy, not, well, I'm sure they pollinate bananas, but fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains. And the good thing about them is that they do help to not only pollinate, but since they are so good at what they do, they can help increase the fruit set. So higher amounts of fruit actually will set and form into the fruit itself. They can help in seed production, and they can also improve crop quality. And when you look at this, I mean, you can read the main details in the book chapter there. But when we're looking at crops, we have things like almonds, which we don't really grow in Texas, even though I met a gentleman last week at a class that I taught that said that he is growing almonds in Burnet, Texas, which I was shocked. And he actually got almonds last year, which I didn't know that you could actually do that. But apparently he has some magical thing that he can. But almonds are typically grown in California, and honeybees are really, really important to being able to produce almonds. You typically need 2 to 3 colonies per acre, and these can help, again, improve those yields, improve the quality of the crop. And same thing with cotton. Obviously, if you've lived in Texas for any period of time, Texas is a cotton state. We produce a lot of cotton. And while this crop is typically a wind pollinated crop, you can put honeybees in those fields to actually help improve the setting of the bolls, which is essentially just the head of the cotton. So when that is in flower, having those honeybees there can actually help to increase the yield and the set of those bolls. Watermelons and apples, these are going to also benefit. So with watermelons, you need about 1 to 2 colonies per acre, whereas apples are going to be 2 to 3 colonies. And again, improving fruit set, it can increase the size of the fruit that you get, and then also the quantity and quality of the yield. With watermelon, it's going to be a little bit different because those are going to have on the same plant, the male and female are, the flowers are different. So the honeybees can help move the pollen from the male flowers into the female flowers. And so when we're talking about dioecious plants like that, it is extremely important to have those pollinators, because they are going to not be able to pollinate themselves other than that, because they have completely separate male and female flowers. Apples, when we're growing those, I have an apple tree in my yard. If you are planting apples, you generally want more than 1 apple tree because you do need cross-pollination for actual optimal fruit set and growth. And my apple tree is a one of those where they've grafted the apple tree. So it has, I want to say 3 different varieties of apples. And if you are doing something like that, if you have cross-pollination plants like that you're going to plant into your landscape for that, make sure that you are getting things that are going to be in bloom at the same time. On my apple tree, even though it's a 3-in-1, 2 of the varieties will flower at the same time, and then the third variety is like a straggler. And so I never get apples on that particular part of the plant. Berries, depending on where you are in Texas, you can have different types of berries. So things like blueberries, those are going to be more East Texas. We also have strawberries, raspberries. I grow blackberries. So berry flowers, even though they're like wide open, they cannot necessarily be pollinated by wind in a good manner. So typically you're going to see better yields when you have those pollinators on those plants that can help to move that pollen. We also have our cucumbers and pumpkins. This is another one that is dioecious, very similar to the watermelon, which if you think about watermelons and pumpkins and cucumbers, they all have that vining plant. So they're all very similar. Squash is kind of also in there. So male and female flowers. So honeybees are going to help to carry that pollen between the male and female flowers. And that's one of those that if you don't have good pollination occurring, you're going to have not as much production of that crop. And if you don't get enough pollen into the female part of the flower, then the fruit can actually become underdeveloped, or it can be misshapen because it doesn't have enough of those male cells or the male sexual genetic information to really grow that fruit. Melons are, again, the same thing, kind of they're in the same category as our watermelons. So these are going to be cantaloupe and honeydew. Again, male, female flowers, and those bees are going to help provide better fruit set, better fruit development, larger fruit, because they're moving that pollen. Sunflowers, we do have people that grow sunflowers, not only for just cut flowers, but there's also people that grow it for seed. And honeybees can be really great at using them in very large commercial fields like you see in the photo here. Sunflowers, while they are mostly wind pollinated, the bees can help to increase production because they are going to increase the seed set and development in the plants that they are capable of pollinating. And a lot of those are going to be hybrid varieties. So if you are growing particular types of sunflowers, you might want to do a little research to see if those are hybrids and if that is going to benefit from those insect pollinators. Then we have our seed crops. So these are going to be things like clover, alfalfa, and mustard. When we're dealing with bees here, they tend to lead to better seed quality because, again, they're making sure that that pollen is transferred, improving the outcome of that crop. So we talked about this a little bit with the pollinator video. We have visual cues that are going to draw in our pollinators. So the first and foremost thing are going to be those petals that they see. And those are going to often be brightly colored. And they are going to cue in on color. They're going to go for shape and size of those as well. And I don't know if it's been described on how insects see, but the way that I kind of describe it is, well, they have faceted eyes, and so each one of those facets is going to pick up a piece of the picture, and they put that together like a jigsaw puzzle. But their picture, their vision isn't very crisp or clear like we think of vision being. Essentially, I would equate it to if you took a digital photo of something and then you blew it up really, really close and it starts to pixelate. That is essentially how an insect will see. So it's a very kind of fuzzy, vague picture that they're getting a generalized shape. They do pick up on color, but it's not this like crisp, clear picture like you would see on the slide here. There are also some flowers that will produce nectar guides. We'll talk about that in a bit. And those are typically going to be for insects that a lot of times they're in the ultraviolet range. And so we can't necessarily always see the nectar guides that are going to be on the flower itself, but insects can see that. The next plant adaptation to attract pollinators is going to be that scent. So strong smells. Again, the smell is going to vary depending on what type of pollinator it is trying to attract. So a lot of times you're going to have a fruity smell or that real kind of strong floral scent. But then we also have plants that have a rotten carrion kind of meaty scent, if those are going to be flies. And then the last thing is going to be those rewards. It's going to be the nectar and the pollen. So the nectar is kind of the main reward because the plant is using that a lot of times to attract those insects in, and the pollen is kind of the secondary. So the plant is going to typically produce more pollen than it really needs to pollinate itself because it knows that, well, I'm not going to say it knows because that would mean that it actually thinks, but it's doing that way it can have some of that pollen consumed by those insects and still have enough that it's going to actually be able to pollinate the plant. When we're looking at our orders of plants, the Coleoptera or the beetles are probably the first insect pollinators from way back in the Jurassic period. They tend to like bowl-shaped flowers that are kind of wide and kind of have everything out there in the open for them to access. They prefer white or kind of dull yellowish green colors more so than other colors. So I know this one is on a bright orange flower, but those insects are not there for the pollen. They are there for each other. They do tend to like strongly fruity smells, and these are going to be active during the day. That means that those flowers are going to need to be open during the daytime. They are not there so much for the nectar, so they can go with plants that have, you know, kind of some nectar, but it doesn't have to produce copious amounts of nectar. And they are either going to have really large kind of open landing platforms, which we'll talk about flower shape in a bit, or they could have a small cluster of flowers. Essentially, when we're talking about beetles, they are going to need a landing platform. They're kind of big and bulky insects, so they need a place that they can land and be kind of stabilized when they are on that flower. The Diptera, those are going to be the flies, mosquitoes, and midges. These are going to be generalist foragers. They do tend to have sparse hairs on their body that can pick up pollen and transfer that over to other flowers. The flowers that they're attracted to tend to be pale in color, so whites like that, or maybe light pinks. We also have the more kind of muscoid flies, which is kind of like a house fly or a blowfly, kind of that house fly shape. They tend to like dull, dark brown to purple type flowers, or flowers that have those types of markings. A lot of times the flowers are going to be flecked with different colors, or not colors, but parts of the flower are going to be translucent where you can actually see through it, and it kind of gives a contrast that that fly can pick up. And like I mentioned previously, there are some of these plants that are going to smell like rotting meat or fecal material or sap or blood, or they have what we would call an unpleasant smell. But to some of those flies, it's going to be very, very attractive. Flies tend not to pick up on nectar guides. They will sometimes go in for funnel shaped flowers, again, depending on what type of mouth part they have. Obviously, if we're talking about a mosquito collecting nectar, they have piercing sucking mouth parts and elongated mouth part. So they can pierce into those funnel like flowers. But then we also have some flies that have sponging mouth parts, and they might not be able to access the nectar in the bottom of those funnel shaped tubes. The Lepidoptera are the butterflies, moths, and skippers. And for them, they have that really, really elongated proboscis that is essentially a siphon tube that they can really probe down into really deep tubular flowers. So they can essentially use any type of flower for their food to get nectar. They open or tube or umbel. The sky's the limit for them. Colors for butterflies tend to be more pinks, purples, reds, oranges, yellows. They aren't necessarily going into the ultraviolet and that sort of thing. They're more down at the other end. They do like a landing pad, so something to kind of hang on to. And they do tend to prefer deep nectar sources. Again, that mouth part allows them to really access that nectar that is deep within the flower. Then we come to our Hymenoptera, which are bees, wasps, and ants. They tend to prefer shallow tubular flowers or umbel flowers. And umbel flowers are like the lantana that you see on the bottom there with my longhorn bee that got cut off. But it's just like a small cluster of kind of trumpet or tubular shaped flowers that are all together. They do like to have landing platforms. They tend to like fragrant, sweet smelling flowers, and color preference for them are whites, yellows, blues, and into the purples and ultraviolet range. When we're looking at flower types, this really will tell you a little bit about the insects that may visit them and how the pollen is produced. When we're looking on the left, we're seeing open access flowers. So they're just kind of out there and everything is exposed and available. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have a restricted access flower where the nectar is going to be more tucked away. So with open access, it's going to essentially allow any insect to access that plant and get to the pollen and nectar. These types of flowers tend not to be as efficient as a restricted access flower at directing pollen onto the insect body. A lot of times there are going to be flowers that have restricted access that when that insect is going deep into that flower to get to the nectar, anther to touch down somewhere on the insect and leave a pollen deposit on it. And then when that insect moves to the next flower, that's going to transfer that pollen over. So open access flowers tend to need a lot of insects coming in and visiting for pollination to occur. So again, it's kind of like open house over there. Restricted access is going to be those flowers that's going to direct them onto the insect. It tends to be a more accurate way of pollination to occur, and so they tend to need less insects visiting those. When we're looking at flower shapes, the first one that we're going to talk about are going to be tubular flowers. And these can either be singular tubular flowers, if you think about, let's see, like yellow bells or esperanza, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You know, those are large kind of tubular flowers. But we also have things like salvia, like you see on the right-hand side. Those are also tubular flowers, but they're kind of clustered together. Tubular flowers are going to typically be best for butterflies and moths and skippers, and then also some of your bees. So more of the longer tongued bees are going to be able to access those. But again, it depends on how that flower is designed and where that nectar is. The ray or flat flower shape, this is one of those kind of open access. It's going to be accessible to a wide variety of insects. So beetles, bees, flies, and then these can also serve as landing platforms for butterflies and moths. The umbels, these are going to be tiny clusters of tubular or funnel-shaped flowers. These are going to be great for bees, flies, wasps, smaller butterflies and moths. Also beetles can get in here because it is a kind of short tube structure that they have. And then the pollen is going to be up and out there. So things like yarrow, the mist flowers, those are going to play into the umbel shape. And then we just have the funky ones. So we have a passion flower that is over on the left-hand side, that those just look like alien spaceships. In the middle, we have a Turk's cap. And if you see, you can actually see a little tiny bee butt sticking out of that Turk's cap there. So somebody has crawled down into that. So that one is a world flower shape. The one on the right-hand side is a peanut, or at least the yellow bloom is a peanut. And these can be accessible, again, depending on the type of flower, bees, flies, wasps, and sometimes beetles, depending on if it's open or not. When we're looking at honeybee color vision, they tend to see more in the right-hand side of the spectrum. So for humans, we see, of course, red through violet. So it's that whole Roy G. Biv, right? So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. But with bees, they tend to see more so yellows, greens, blues, violet, but they also can see into the ultraviolet range. Honeybees cannot see red colors typically. It's not that it disappears, because I have had somebody ask me that question before. It's not like if something's red, they just can't see it at all. It's just they don't see it as being red. It's more of a gray type color. The bottom picture that you see here is showing you nectar guides that are in the ultraviolet range. So when we look at the picture that is on the left-hand side, that is what we as humans would see. So it's a nice, pretty yellow flower. But if we were a honeybee or an insect that can see into that ultraviolet range, we would see something that looks totally different. And so you can see that that's kind of directing them exactly where they need to go to get what they're looking for. When we're looking at making a habitat that is inviting for honeybee plants or honeybees, color, think about color, obviously, from the previous slide. So think about what color range you're doing. And it's not that you can't put things that are red in there. Again, if you have plants that have red flowers that have really strong smells and produce a lot of nectar, those bees might be attracted to it, not necessarily for the color, but for the scent that it's giving off. So all of those things are going to play into it. So I'm not saying that you can't necessarily do something that is red or orange. I'm just saying that it might be better that they're going to target those other plants more readily if those red flowers don't have a really strong fragrance that is attracted to them. So when we're looking at that, think about color. You want to clump your plants. So you see in this slide here, they did a really good job of clumping plants together. Essentially, that's going to make it easier for the insects to find those particular plants because there's a larger amount of them. So it's increasing the size of it, it's increasing the color, and it's also increasing the smell that that plant is giving off. So when you're going to the nursery to buy plants to draw in honeybees, don't buy one of this plant, one of this plant, one of this plant. You want to buy, I usually say at least 3 of the same plants, and you're going to clump those together. You want to also make sure that you are going to have blooms spring through fall. So depending on what plant you're dealing with, some of those plants are going to bloom all at one time and then they're done. There are other plants that will put on blooms, and then when those die, they'll have other blooms that are coming on. And so they're going to have on the same plant overlapping blooming periods. This is something that is important to kind of pay attention to, because if you have plants that are going to bloom all at one time and then be gone, you need to make sure that you have other plants in the landscape nearby that are going to fill in as blooming after those one plants are done blooming. So make sure that you are going to have a succession of bloom periods, spring through fall, whether that is with a variety of plants or with the same plant or whatever. When you're planting your plants, even though we're clumping, we need to make sure that we are accounting for how large that plant is going to grow when it's mature. A lot of people make the mistake of buying, you know, you got like a little tiny plant that you buy at the nursery, you put that in and you put them all close together because they're little tiny plants. And then when they start growing, they get huge and it's very difficult because they don't have enough space to really grow. So while it may look, I don't know, bare, I guess, when you're first installing a landscape, space your plants out so they have room to reach their full growth potential. So looking at creating a pollinator garden, like I mentioned, we're providing nectar and pollen spring through fall. So that means that you're going to have things blooming spring through fall. Your book chapter is going to give you ideas on what blooming at certain times of the year. So definitely check that out. You want to try to go native when possible. And the plants that I am talking about later on today are going to be native plants to this area of the world. Why we're encouraging you to try to do natives, I mean, there's a lot of plants that aren't native that are going to be great nectar producers and that sort of thing. And if you want to plant those, that's perfectly fine. But those plants may not necessarily survive our summers. You know, July and August in the past few years have been brutal on, you know, not only plants, but also the animals that rely on those plants. So making sure that you are trying to do a lot of native plants, and not just native to Texas, but native to your part of Texas. Texas is a huge state, and plants that we have here that are native aren't necessarily going to work all over the state. You know, El Paso is going to be very different from Houston, and Lubbock is going to be very different from the Rio Grande Valley. You have to take that into account. You want to try to avoid monocultures. Don't plant all of the same plant because, again, once that blooms and those blooms are done, you're going to be done. You want to plant in clumps, but you want to diversify your clumps. So make sure that you have multiple clumps within the landscape. And then if you have certain habitats, depending on where your spaces are, if you have particular areas where your bees are, if you can connect those areas using what we call a pollinator corridor, so you're going to essentially almost create like a sidewalk for the insects, but you're going to do that with plants. So you're not necessarily walking on it, but they're going to have resources or blooming plants and nectar and pollen to connect one habitat to the next habitat. So you're directing their flow and making sure that they have food within that particular corridor. The big duh one on this slide is avoid pesticides. I think that that's kind of a, yeah, everybody should know that already, but just in case. Avoid pesticides because those pesticides are going to affect your bees and other pollinators. And then you also need to take into account what you're doing with the bees. So if you are wanting to create honey, you need to do a little bit of research and figure out what plants are going to be best for your honey production. Some plants are going to produce more nectar than others. There are other, you might want to go for flavors of some sort. So if you have them foraging on particular things, that can flavor the honey in a certain way. So those are also things that you can take into consideration. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier, making sure that your plants are going to have blooms that are accessible to the bees, that they are going to be the right colors for the bees. So again, yellows, blues, purples, whites, single flowers that are open or umbels. We want to try to have low maintenance plants. And this, again, it depends on, I guess, where you're putting the plants. Are you relying on rainfall to take care of these plants, or is this going to be under an irrigation system that you're creating this garden for the bees? And then they're going to actually, because if you have supplemental water on these plants, then that can really help things when it's really hot and dry in the summertime. So take that into account when you're choosing those plants, because if you're not going to have supplemental water, that might affect what type of plants you're going to utilize, because underneath drought conditions, some of these plants might not survive, but if they do survive, they might not bloom as readily. And that's really what we're going for when we're looking for honeybee plants. Try to target low maintenance plants that are drought tolerant. And again, something that is going to fit within your ecoregion. And there is a section in the book that has a nice little map that talks about the ecoregions of Texas, which we'll have a map here in a few minutes. This is another huge one, and this is something that I harp on, not just for pollinators or honeybees. This is for all insects that I deal with. This is kind of, I guess, my soapbox. When we're in the summertime, it's really, really important that we provide safe water resources for our insects. And a lot of people that I talk to, they're like, oh, well, I have a stock tank, or I have a water bucket for my dogs in the backyard, or I have a bird bath. Okay, well, that's all well and good, and that's fantastic, but are insects able to access those large bodies of water in a safe manner, or are they going to drown? So this is something that I encourage pretty much everybody that I talk to do, and that is providing water for insects. I do it in my yard year round, but I really encourage people to definitely do this in the really hot, dry times of the year. And there are a variety of resources that you can do. If you do have ponds, put in some plant or vegetation where the insects can then crawl down, onto the vegetation and get to that water. You can, if you have large bodies of water like a bird bath, you can put a large rock in there. You can also get like little bath toys that are meant for kids that float, and you can stick those in the water again so the insects can get to the water safely. If you have any old container that holds water, put in pebbles and you can put water in that, and that can provide those insects with water in a safe manner. The two specialty ones are the ones at the top, both on the left and the right hand side. So on the left, I have no idea what that thing is called, but you essentially will screw a mason jar on that, fill it up with water, and then it will, gravity pull down into the tray that has those little grooves that is accessible for those insects. Again, it's enough for them to access the water. It is not going to be a large body that they're going to drown in it. And then on the right-hand side, that is one that I have discovered. I need to do some tests on that. And these are called bee cups. It's a lady out of Dallas, Fort Worth area that created them. She has again, we can't see it because it's UV, but there is ultraviolet paint on the inside of that cup to direct them to that resource. And these are very small, they're very shallow. So you do have to have them in an area that they would get filled up with water on a regular basis, but they are definitely something that you can put out. I have mine obviously in potted plants, and it just makes it really easy. And they come in all different colors. So here is the map. I believe this is the same map that you have in the book chapter. And this is just showing you the Texas ecoregions. There are quite a lot of them. And I do want to point out that, it's not necessarily like certain parts of Texas, because if you look at the high plains versus the rolling plains, those are different. So if you're like north of Amarillo, you might be in the high plains. Whereas if you're in Amarillo itself, you could be either in the high plains or the rolling plains, depending on what part of Amarillo you're in. And then if you look at the Blackland prairies, that goes clear from North Texas, north of Dallas, clear down to San Antonio. And if you're in the Blackland prairies, you pretty much know it because, it's black clay. Austin, where I am, it depends on what side of I-35 you're on as to what area you're in. So if you're on the eastern part of I-35 in Austin, you're going to be in the Blackland Prairies. But if you're on the west side of I-35 in Austin, you're in Cross Timbers and Prairies. So know your ecoregion, and that is going to help direct you and make choices as to which plants are going to work best in your area. All right. I think maybe take a 10-minute break before we get into plants. Would that work for everybody? Are there any questions before we go to break?
Yeah, I know I had one in the Q&A. Let's see. So how far away can bees detect the nectar guides, in parentheses, ultraviolet?
Don't really know. Do you know that one, Garrett?
I really don't know. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
the way that insects see, it's like usually it's like the big general shape of the plant first. And then as they get closer to that, it's more of the color. And then
mhm.
as they get really close, it tends to be the smell. But I don't know how far necessarily that is.
I bet they can almost see for almost a half mile, I'd imagine. But I'm not quite sure how long. I'd have to look that up. And so maybe during the break I can there must be some paper on it. I'm gonna go back in the chat. Yeah, people's kind of commenting what they use for water for the bees. Okay, so Lee Little said, is nectar flow consistent throughout the year, or is it dependent on the amount of rain you get during the year?
It's going to vary, and it varies not necessarily it varies from the type of plant that you're dealing with, but it's also because some plants are going to produce more nectar than others, but it also is going to depend on how stressed that plant is. I mean, the healthier and it's getting water and all of the resources that it's needs, it's going to be able to produce more of the nectar and pollen, but it's not necessarily going to, if it's stressed by drought, it's just going to be kind of like, I can't do anything.
Yeah, imagine the concentration of sugar in the nectar too also changes in the
Yeah,
season and by year. Yeah. And probably the pollen, everything with
yeah.
a tree and a plant.
It drought, I mean, anytime that we're in drought, it's kind of like everything is affected because you have the hot, dry conditions, which affects the soil, which then affects the plants, which
Mhm.
then affects what the plant's producing, which then affects the animals that are, attracted to that. So it's just like this big giant snowball thing that builds.
Well, perfect. Yeah, so we will take a 10-minute break and then maybe come back at right around 10:30. As for the video, we post that in the chat, and so I'll also send an email. So if you guys want to see the full video with the narration, everybody will have access to that.
Okay, cool.